Hello, I'm happy to be back in the Reformed Church of Rhinebeck. I would be happier if it were possible for you to join me, but we have to take our restoration step by step. We do that, we return to whatever version of normal is going to be possible for us in the midst of this pandemic during the season called Pentecost. This is the season of the year, 50 days after the time of Passover, when in the calendar of Israel there was a festival of harvest called Shavuot, which means weeks in Hebrew. 7 weeks, 49, 50 days, Pentecost. It simply carries on that great celebration of the productivity of the earth, which anchored the calendar of ancient Israel. Barley harvest at the time of Passover, wheat harvest at the time of Pentecost. And in each case, the practice of celebration for Israel to remember where Israel had come from. Passover marked the time, of course, when it was possible for the Israelites to leave their slavery in Egypt and to seek out a land of promise. Pentecost marked also the giving of the Torah, the law, by means of the greatest of all the Israelite prophets, Moses, so that they would always have guidance through the course of their existence as the chosen of God. Within early Christianity, of course, the Feast of Pentecost took on a new meaning because of what we celebrate on the very Sunday called Pentecost. Namely, that when Peter and his apostolic companions were gathered together in Jerusalem in the time after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, the Spirit of God became manifest in a new way, came to be offered to the whole of humanity. And when this occurred in Jerusalem at that first Pentecost, Peter explained the event by referring to the prophet Joel. Joel had looked forward to a time when the Spirit of God would be shed upon all flesh, men, women, and children, and they would all have the capacity to do what other people of spirit did, namely the prophets, to prophesy themselves. The Feast of Pentecost is a feast of the universal availability of God's Spirit. It is an extraordinary celebration because it says something that had not been claimed before. Instead of seeing the Spirit of God as something that belongs only to very selective people, people such as chosen prophets, properly selected high priests, those in the royal line of David, God's Spirit was in fact freely available to all. That is an extraordinary, radical, and revolutionary claim, which is part and parcel of the message of Christianity. Throughout the whole of the season of Pentecost, because it really is not one Sunday, it is a time of the year. Through this season of Pentecost, I want to reflect on the ways in which God's Spirit is available to each of us by following the wisdom of biblical teaching. Peter pointed back to Joel, as I mentioned, in order to explain what was going on within him and with all of his companions in Jerusalem at that time in the year 32, when the availability of Spirit became plain to them. And in much the same way, we can understand what it means for the Spirit of God to become available to us by turning our attention to biblical teaching, not only the prophet Joel, but also even earlier, very clear indications of the way in which God's Spirit works within us. For that reason, I have called all of the discussions that we'll have during Pentecost Season of the Holy Spirit, because it is the time when we particularly concentrate on the ways in which God's Spirit is moving within us. And I'll be following through passages from Scripture that explain this availability and, in the process, also very clearly indicate just what this Spirit of God is that we speak of. Of course, God's Spirit is available at all times. It is not something that we make happen. It is something that we are sensitive to, or not. But although it's always available, that doesn't mean that we are always attuned to how the Spirit is moving within us. And it's right for us, especially, I think, during a time when we all seek particular guidance, to ask, how does Scripture understand Spirit to be guiding us, supporting us, and enabling us to discern how we should move forward? During the 4 presentations that we have together, I'd like to concentrate on the ways in which God's Spirit offers us insight of differing kinds. The first kind I'll refer to is the insight of action. That is, the insight that we draw on, sometimes without even thinking about it, in order to make a decision, to commit to a path, to find a way forward. When we've discussed that this week, next week I'd like to discuss the insight of ethics, which moves from the field of an individual's action to the way that people can live together in the life of society. That will be followed in the 3rd week by the insight of faith. How is it that faith grows within a person? I'm very happy that we're discussing this issue within a Reformed church, because John Calvin understood very clearly that faith is not something that one builds entirely on one's own. It is not the work of an individual person. It is rather the cooperative agreement between that person and the Spirit of God. So that 3rd session has a particular interest for people who gathered in this place in the Reformed Church. And then finally, I want to speak about the insight of transformation, the way in which Spirit goes about changing people so that they are not the same as they were at the time before their encounter with God's Spirit. I'm taking these types of insight in the order that I am because I'm also following through chronologically in the development of the Scriptures overall. So we actually begin with the book of Judges, which by common consent among scholars is actually the oldest book overall that there is within the Hebrew Bible. actually written before the time even that the book of Genesis was written. Written so long ago, around 1200 before the Common Era, that the book of Judges comes from a time when Israel has no king in the line of David. Israel has no capital city because it has not yet conquered Jerusalem. Israel is not what you and I would call a country with a government, with a standing military. Instead, Israel at this stage is a people. They have a sense of commonality because of their language, Hebrew, because of their common memory of Abraham as their ancestor, a common sense of deliverance, of their escape from Egypt, and also a common sense of destiny, that there is, in fact, a land of promise in the place where they're living. But exactly that promise in the time of the judges often came under threat. And the particular threat we're considering today comes from the 4th and the 5th chapters of the book of Judges. You'll see that in the particular handout for this first session, where I have translated the particular passages that I think show us the way in which the book of Judges understands God's Spirit to operate. And it operates on behalf of decisive action in the face of difficulty. It's something of a mystery, I think, how it is that any human being goes about making decisions and committing actions. Sometimes we engage in activities which are quite complex, such as driving a car, say, where we operate by a combination of what we've learned in the past, by our experience, by instinct, by anticipation, by reason, in order to behave in the way that we do. It's worth reflecting how we know what to do, even under ordinary circumstances. I don't recommend thinking about this while you're actually driving, because actually it can cause you to be inattentive to the task at hand. But it's worth reflecting on how it is that we all seek a way forward by means of discernment. And this story, focused on the prophet named Deborah, is a story about insight leading to action. As I mentioned earlier, it's set around 1200 before the Common Era, and also near Bethel on the Mount of Ephraim, in the hill country. Hill country because that was where it was possible for Israelites to settle during this period of the Iron Age. The land that they went to, the land called Canaan, already had inhabitants within it when the Israelites arrived. And some of those inhabitants had developed civilization, meaning cities. One of those cities is called Hazor. It is very well established today as an archaeological site, had existed there from the previous era, the Bronze Age. And in the way of people in cities, they were antagonistic to the agricultural and nomadic Israelites who came within their territory. The people of Hazor expected the Israelites to adopt their gods, the gods of Hazor, not the ancient gods of Israel. They expected the Israelites to honor their lands, those of the people of Hazor. They expected tribute, tax, out of the Israelites. And that was not at all the way in which Israel understood the compact, the covenant that they had with their God, with Yahweh. And so there was conflict. There was the issue of how Israel should proceed, facing an enemy much more powerful than they. One of the symbols of the power of Hazor was that Hazor had chariots actually made out of iron, drawn by oxen and horses. The Israelites had only a volunteer army and scant resources by way of weaponry. So Deborah is in a position of offering prophecy in her place, which, as I say, is near Bethel, and is described as sitting under a palm tree, a symbol of the productivity of the earth as blessed by Yahweh. And Deborah tells a commander of Israel, whose name is Barak, that he should go out and meet the army that comes from Hazor instead of retreating from it, instead of hiding from it. Barak replies to her, hedging his bets, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you do not go with me, I will not go." Barak wants Deborah to take the same risk to life that she has just invited him to take. Deborah replies, "Go ahead, I will go. But this way you have taken will not be your crown, because by the hand of a woman, God will sell Sisera." Sisera was the general sent out from Hazor. Now this, of course, sets up the expectation when you hear this prophecy of Deborah that it's actually going to be by Deborah's hand that Sisera will fall. That is not going to be the case, but we can leave that part of the story for the very end. As it proceeds, we get an account in prose, such as just read, in chapter 4 of Judges, and then in chapter 5, an even more ancient version of the story, which gives the account in poetry. It is the equivalent of the kind of recitation of Homer that brought us the Odyssey, only in Hebrew form. This is some of the most interesting literature within the Hebrew Bible, and at the same time, it also speaks most directly about the way in which the Spirit of God operates and the extent to which a human being can be aware of the Spirit of God. In the part of the book of Judges, chapter 5, which is written in poetry, there's a very vivid description of what it was like to live under the oppression of the city of Hazor in the countryside. And so you'll see on the handouts, Judges 5:7 reads, "Peasants ceased in Israel, ceased until Deborah arose as a mother in Israel." Peasants had ceased in the sense that there was so much by way of demand for tribute and for land ownership on the part of the people of Hazor that agriculture had become impossible. The passage goes on, they chose new gods. Some in Israel were willing to compromise and accept the gods of Hazor. Then war was at the gates, and the question is raised, was shield or spear seen among 40,000 in Israel? And of course, the expectation is, the answer to that question is no. You got 40,000 people, and they are basically defenseless agricultural nomads before a city which has got a standing army and very high quality weapons. And yet, as the story goes on, it relates the unlikely success of the Israelites. And it is an unlikely success because Barak followed the guidance of Deborah. Under her instruction, Barak drew the troops with their chariots of iron belonging to the city of Hazor into an area of the valley which included a wadi. A wadi is something that we actually do encounter in the Hudson Valley, though not to the extreme extent that I've actually seen it in the land of Israel today. But if you take a walk around our many trails, you will see ravines which, for much of the year, are simply dry, it would appear. But then, during particular seasons of rain, or when there's heavy runoff, these can swell up and become the size of an impressive stream. Well, in ancient Israel, because in many places you have an extreme differential of elevation over a very short period, it's possible to have rainfall or even snowfall in the mountains and have that run off and literally spring up in the wilderness and run into a wadi. It's a dry riverbed which is not dry all the time. I once had the experience of being in a car right near the Dead Sea when a wadi actually jumped up in the desert, I saw it, and carried our car for a couple of meters, fortunately not off the road and therefore not into the Dead Sea. In the battle with the troops from Hazor, headed by Sisera, Barak profited from the fact that the wadi they were fighting around did much more damage to the forces of Sisera than to the forces of Barak. And so Judges 5:20 through 21 says, "From heaven the stars fought. From their circuits they fought with Sisera. The Wadi Kishon shoved them away. Ancient Wadi, Wadi Kishon, lead on my soul in strength." Deborah's prophecy was, to a significant extent, grounded in the discernment that the forces of Sisera could be put at a disadvantage such that the forces of the Israelites could emerge victorious. But the story does not end there. Remember, Deborah had promised Barak, by the hand of a woman, God will sell Sisera. But it turns out in the story that the woman you might have anticipated is not Deborah. Instead, it's someone named Yael, and Yael is described as married to someone who is not from Israel, but belongs to the people called the Kenites. It's interesting. It means that the Israelites and the Kenites at this time have a shared set of interests that they bring to a mutual confrontation with the people of Hazor. So in the account concerning Deborah's prophecy, the army of the people of Hazor is defeated near the Wadi Kishon. And Sisera, the general of the army, flees into a tent. It's interesting, it's a tent. These are nomadic peoples. as I mentioned. The tent is that of Yael. She provides him, apparently, with hospitality, has him lie down, feeds him, he rests, and then she strikes. It is she who kills Sisera. Now, was Deborah's prophecy right, or was the prophecy wrong when Deborah said that by the hand of a woman, God will sell Sisera? The reason for the story being told in that way is a reminder. By means of the Spirit of God operating within us, we can, in difficult circumstances, make very refined decisions. We are, in fact, all going to have to do that in the weeks immediately ahead. Decisions are going to have to be made by each of us, and they'll be made on the basis of all different possible considerations. But the prophecy of Deborah is a reminder that one can move ahead, one can become decisive in action, and in the end, victorious. But in all that does not in any way suggest that we understand the full range of God's Spirit. We are informed by Spirit. We come to discern possibilities which permit us not only to survive, but also to do very well. I am personally confident that we'll find all these in the weeks to come, difficult though they are. But through that entire process, we can never kid ourselves, suggesting that it's we who create our own future. We don't create the future. We don't guide destiny. But it is possible for us, by discernment, to become aware of the Spirit of God, to become sensitive to its promptings, and on that basis, to take the actions that we should, and in some cases must do, in order to see to it that we leave those around us in a better position than they are at the moment. I wish you all the best for this season of the Spirit, and I also look forward to our meeting next time when we can move away from the field of individual action, which I've stressed today because we've been focused on this ancient book of Judges, and we'll move into a consideration of how it is that Spirit informs our ethics, our decision of how to live with one another within society. Until that time, I hope very much that you have a good week and that you will do well. Take care.